The following podcast is banned in the state of Florida for talking about a dangerous leftist book, the Bible. Like the Bible, this podcast contains frank discussions on sensitive topics, including sex, violence, and cursing. Please proceed with caution. Do you indeed decree righteousness, you rulers? Do you judge the peoples with equity? No. You devise evil in your hearts, and your hands deal out violence in the land. This is the word in black and red. Hello, and welcome to the Word in Black and Red, where we read the Bible from a leftist and liberationist perspective to elucidate the way people of faith and their comrades can understand the Bible as a source of healing, love, and liberation for all people. I am your host, Micah the Wise Old Llama MB, joined today by the wonderful Avery Arden from Blessed Are the Binary Breakers podcast, the wonderful W. Scott McCandless from the Retelling the Bible podcast, and the wonderful Matt Meyer from The Word in Black and Red, and also beginning to branch out into a wonderful new project that we're excited to tell you a little bit more about as it comes out, but I'll tell you the name right now is the Liberation Bible School, and I'm just so excited for what that is going to lead to. Y'all know these wonderful people, and so we will go ahead and dive on into the text. Exodus 34 through 35:3. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. I'll write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke into pieces. Get ready in the morning and come up to Mount Sinai. Stand there on top of the mountain in front of me. No one else can come up with you. Don't allow anyone even to be seen anywhere on the mountain. Don't even let sheep and cattle graze in front of the mountain." So Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. He got up early in the morning and climbed up Mount Sinai, just as the Lord had commanded him. He carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him, and proclaimed the name, the Lord. The Lord passed in front of him, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God who is compassionate and merciful, very patient, full of great loyalty and faithfulness, showing great loyalty to 1,000 generations, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion, yet by no means clearing the guilty, punishing for their parents' sins their children and their grandchildren, as well as the 3rd and the 4th generation. At once Moses bowed to the ground and worshipped. He said, "If you approve of me, my Lord, please go along with us. Although these are stubborn people, forgive our guilt and our sin, and take us as your own possession." The Lord said, "I now make a covenant. In front of all your people, I'll perform dramatic displays of power that have never been done before anywhere on earth or in any nation. All the people who are around you will see what the Lord does, because I will do an awesome thing with you. Be sure to obey what I command you today. I'm about to drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Be careful that you don't make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you are going, or it will become a dangerous trap for you. You must tear down their altars, smash their sacred stone pillars, and cut down their sacred poles. You must not bow down to another god, because the Lord is passionate. The Lord's name means a passionate God. Don't make a covenant with those who live in the land. When they prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, they may invite you, and you may end up eating some of the sacrifice. Then you might go and choose their daughters as wives for your sons. And their daughters who prostitute themselves with their gods might lead your sons to prostitute themselves with their gods. Don't make metal gods for yourselves. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. You should eat unleavened bread for 7 days, as I commanded you, at the set time in the month of Abib, because it was in the month of Abib that you came out of Egypt. Every first offspring is mine. That includes all your male livestock, the oldest offspring of cows and sheep, but a donkey's oldest offspring you may ransom with a sheep. Or if you don't ransom it, you must break its neck. You should ransom all of your oldest sons. No one should appear before me empty-handed. You should do your work for 6 days, but on the 7th day you should rest. Even during plowing or harvest time you should rest. You should observe the festival of weeks, for the early produce of the wheat harvest, and the gathering festival at the end of the year. All your males should appear 3 times a year before the Lord God, Israel's God. I will drive out nations before you and extend your borders. No one will desire and try to take your land if you go up and appear before the Lord your God 3 times a year. Don't slaughter the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened. The sacrifice of the Passover festival shouldn't be left over until the morning. Bring the best of the early produce of your farmland to the Lord your God's temple. Don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. The Lord said to Moses, Write down these words, because by these words I hereby make a covenant with you and with Israel. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He didn't eat any bread or drink any water. He wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words. Moses came down from Mount Sinai. As he came down from the mountain with the 2 covenant tablets in his hands, Moses didn't realize that the skin of his face shone brightly because he had been talking with God. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw the skin of Moses' face shining brightly, they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called them closer. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and Moses spoke with them. After that, all the Israelites came near as well, and Moses commanded them everything that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went into the Lord's presence to speak with God, Moses would take the veil off until he came out again. When Moses came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, the Israelites would see that the skin of Moses' face was shining brightly. So Moses would put the veil on his face again until the next time he went in to speak with the Lord. Moses gathered together the whole Israelite community and said to them, These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. Do your work for 6 days, but the 7th day should be holy to you, a Sabbath of complete rest for the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath will be put to death. Don't start a fire in any of your homes on the Sabbath day. So we have this passage that has a couple of different moving parts here. First, we have this section where Moses goes up to meet with God again and restore the thing that had been broken because of the golden calf incident, or Calfgate, as it is known in the United States. And then we have this little passage, this poem, that is, on the one hand, quite beautiful, and then ends with the strange reminder that generational curses seem to be important here as we read. Then we have this renewal of the broken covenant, again seen as the restoration of the stone tablets, but here it is basically a restatement of what was on those stone tablets, the 10 Commandments. You don't get all of them, but you do get a lot more explanation of what's happening with these different ones, particularly around idolatry. And then you have this passage where Moses' face is shining brightly. So we'll go ahead and take these just piece by piece as we go through here. But what are y'all's first thoughts as we enter into this strange little text?
One thing that is going on is we have a mix-up of sources here. We have like a law here, which, as you noted, is a little different and hits different points. It's actually probably an older version of the law. Scholars would identify it with the J source, the early source. And what's happened here is that somebody has edited it together so that the law that was received before, that was destroyed, is now replaced with a second law. But this giving of the law was independently a separate source that has been put into the story afterwards. And so that little bit about this being a second set of stones is a redactional trick to make it all sort of work together. So that's part of what's going on. I find the laws themselves, they are different. they're not peppy and memorable like, the great 10 commandments that you have in other places. They're different. They put the emphasis on different things and some weird things in there that really don't seem as important as, what we get when we get the Big Ten. The one, that's somewhere in here, how you cook a calf is really important, apparently. And of course, it becomes very important in later Judaism. But it's this sort of weird throwaway. Oh, well, you can't cook a calf in its mother's milk. Okay, so it's like a recipe. Okay, this recipe is out. It puts this emphasis on different kinds of stuff, probably because it's a very primitive form of the law. At an early, very tribal time, these were the things that were really important, apparently, to the people.
This version really emphasizes the idea that it is dangerous to get too close to God, that not even the sheep and cattle can graze here. Yeah, I can't remember if the earlier in the book, later in history version had that, but it really strikes me that even animals should stay clear.
Yeah, I was reading in a commentary by Walter Brueggemann, who suggested this is coming from another source, but not which one, and the J source does make sense. More to it when we get to God's self-naming part. Some of that language in English, as we've translated it, is a lot more bodily in the Hebrew, which is pretty characteristic of the way God is depicted in the J source.
Is an example of that is compassionate, the womb word here?
Yeah, that's one of them.
We'll dive into the womb word in a second because that's one of my favorites. But one of the things that is really interesting here in this passage is it is exactly what all of you have been pointing out so far, is that this source seems decidedly different from Exodus 20. Exodus 20 uses the very formal name of God. It is the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, the name that we try not to pronounce here, but Adonai is how our Jewish siblings will say it. Adonai Elohim. That is God's very formal name. That is, Mr. Jesus H. Christ, all spelled out like that. It's very formal, it's very straightforward, and then we see after that, throughout the rest of the passage, it's almost all Elohim. There is one other Adonai there in the passage, but it is this formal name of God. And Elohim is, again, a more formal way of referring to God. When we see sources talk about Elohim, God is almost always removed and a little bit farther away, as we've explored through the Torah, that God is separated in some way from what's happening here. But here we see the word Adonai, which is God's name, God's first name, God's very personal name. This is the cool teacher who asks you to call him Steve instead of, Mr. Roderick. This is God's intimate name being used here throughout this passage that keeps coming up again and again, and that is what forms the basis of the Yahweh source. And the Yahweh source is almost always more personal, more relatable, more embodied, all of those sort of things happening. But here we see this strange move where, like earlier in the text, we saw the Yahweh source having God in the garden, face to face with the humans, playing with them, exploring with them, creating with them. And now we have this new situation where that very up and close personal God, well, you can't really get too close because your face will start shining and the sheep will be obliterated.
Apparently, yeah. Since we're talking a lot about the name, when it comes to translating the Tetragrammaton, I really do not like how in, standard English translations, both the word Adonai, which does mean my Lord, and Moses actually uses it here in verse 9. And the Tetragrammaton is the Lord capitalized. When you say it out loud, they sound exactly the same. And for me, when translating a language, that's a major pet peeve of mine. If you're translating two different words with the same English word, I do not like it because casual readers or listeners won't realize what's going on. And I also think, like you were saying, Micah, that The tetragram, which I'll say the name of God is, like you said, it's the intimate one. It's the really close and personal one. And so to say Lord just doesn't have that sense to me. And I do understand why throughout Jewish tradition it has often been, when you see it in the text, you say Adonai out loud so you don't have to pronounce it. That makes sense to me. But when it comes to translating it into English, I just don't think Lord, even if you capitalize it and make it fancy, makes sense, because Exodus 3 is where God shares this name with Moses for the first time. So a human gets this name, and God says, the famous I am who I am, or you can translate it I am who I will be. There's various things with the tense you can do. But the Lord doesn't convey that sense at all. Like, God is saying, my name is this thing, I am who I will be. And the Lord is not that at all. For me, like, when I translate it, I don't have a perfect translation. I don't think it's possible. But I prefer, like, living God, which I've seen people do, because it has the sense of being, which is in the original text. I personally like to just translate it as being without the word the before it, so that you can tell it's a name. Because when you put the, it doesn't in English at least make you think, oh, an intimate name. And also the article the is not in the Hebrew. But yeah, for me, I really like being, because it harkens back to God's explanation for their name, the whole I am who I am, which for me is really honing in on God's steadfastness, God's constancy, that God will be always. Like, that is the sort of core of this name. I think it's extra important in passages like this, where God is using, just like in the previous passage we were looking at with God showing Moses their backside, and again God proclaims the name to Moses, and to me it's meant to reestablish the intimacy that they had lost during the whole golden calves and breaking of the stones incident. That God is using it to say, hey, remember, I'm constant, I'm here. And I also feel like God is reminding themselves of that, because all the things they say in the poem, that, oh yeah, like sort of reestablishing for themselves too, that yes, I am merciful, I'm patient, I am super loyal, so of course I won't abandon this people I promised not to abandon, even if they didn't keep their end of the bargain.
I just want to read these verses again with an alternate translation there. Instead of the Lord offering I am as God's name here, I am came down in the cloud and stood there with him, and proclaimed the name I am. I am passed in front of him and proclaimed, I am, a God who is compassionate and merciful, very patient, full of great loyalty and faithfulness.
I like that much better, personally.
I am and I will be.
I also like, I don't know that it technically has to be translated stand, but I only noticed this time that it says that, yeah, God stands with Moses, which is a very, like, sort of anthropomorphic version of God, this very embodied God who is able to stand, just like in Genesis 3 or 2 when they walk in the garden. Like, Christians sort of tend to, disembody God, which is fine. Like it makes sense from a theological perspective to an extent, but like it's a good reminder that especially like the Torah, well, and a lot of the Hebrew Bible in general, has a very embodied God.
So speaking of embodied, we have this thing happening in the beginning where we have the 2 cut stone tablets, and Moses has to go and recut them. Now, I am not confident that we had anywhere previously Moses described as cutting the first stones, right? And so you have this moment where God gave us something. God gave us the commandments on the first stones and gave us the stones as well. And then Moses had to go down and break them and demolish them. And when he goes back up, instead of God recreating the stones for us, humans have to participate in the creation of the commandments. That a human has to bring the stone tablets back up to God in order for God to write them on and give us back the law. And so I just think that's an interesting part here, where we see so often throughout the theology of the Bible is that this is a both and relationship, that this is a we have to do our part kind of theology, where God is willing to write on our hearts what needs to be written, but we have to be willing to bring our hearts there to allow it to happen.
Yeah, you're right. I just went and checked, and God just in Exodus 24 says, "I will give you the tablets of stone." So yeah, you're right. This time Moses has to be part of it in a more direct way.
Well, and that follows through a lot in the early sources, that it's the very human experience of God that we bring, and then God writes upon what we bring. And, we come as we are, we experience God and bring that back. And I think that's central to this entire passage, because that's, I think, what Moses then becomes. He becomes sort of that tablet that God writes on when he speaks for God to the people.
One of the things that really makes this passage quite different from Exodus 20, where we have those other laws, are, again, that because this is a Yahwistic source, it is much more focused on God's relationship with us. In the 10 Commandments that we receive in Exodus 20, 2 of them, arguably 3, are about God's relationship with humanity, and the rest of them are about humanity's relationship with each other. Don't steal, don't covet, don't murder, keep Sabbath rest, all of those sort of things. And it's really just about worship that God is concerned with. But here, all the laws are relational, and it begins with this preface that is saying, who is it that we have a relationship with? Well, it is I am, a God who is compassionate and merciful. And a lot of these words in here also have their own deep meaning as they go.
I mean, we've been putting these 2 laws against each other. And one thing I would want to say, just to widen us out a little bit as we get further into this chapter, we should really be looking at Exodus 19 through 24, and even for later parts a little further, but through 24:8, just kind of what the parallel is, where we have coming to the mountain, God coming, giving a law. There's repeated language about taking the land as well. It's like a mini version that happens after the incident of the golden calf. But one of the things I find interesting, just to open that poem, is going back to the 10 Commandments. It does start with self-identification. Some traditions do place that as the first word, and the first word of the 10 words being, "I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of slavery, out of the house of Egypt." And that's a wonderful thing, and that's a wonderful reason to serve this God. But here it's based on the sheer gravitas of God's character. That not just because I did this really great thing for you, you owe me, but just on the basis of who God is, just period. And this whole poem is prefacing the law that comes after it.
In particular, it's interesting that the contrast between jealous God in Exodus 20 and the same idea that is communicated and translated as a passionate God in Exodus 34.
I'm just thinking more about these 2 ways of looking at the law, or these 2 law traditions too. Exodus is like the foundational text in liberation theology that the early liberation theologists point to, that say that God is revealed as being a God of liberation. And thinking about trying to build a bridge to people who don't necessarily see themselves as being oppressed people or needing to be involved in the project of liberation. Here's another set of laws that says, okay, so maybe you didn't need to be free from oppression. Maybe everything has been completely fine for you, but also these very similar laws should still also be compelling because of the very nature of the God that you serve. Even if it does not personally affect you, or you do not feel that you are personally affected by this project of liberation, that is the project of God based on God's character, and based on that alone, you should want to be on board.
So the word here that we have for compassionate is a really interesting word.
Walter Brueggemann's citing Phyllis Tribble as making the case for that word being related to womb. So describes it as a positive inclination that a mother would have toward a child. It's like a womb-like mother love.
Yeah, it's one of the instances of feminine imagery for God that isn't as blatant as some of the others, where it's not flat out saying God is a mother or God is like a mother, but just having compassion within this word's meaning is associated, with motherhood.
So the word is rakum, and it is this word that connotes softness and gentleness and cherishing of a thing. It is very much so a term associated with motherhood, and it's related to the noun version, which is rechem, which means womb. And so rachum is compassionate, and rechem is womb, that it is a place of growth and development. And so there's this, this idea that God is the God who is giving birth to us, who is raising us up, who is developing us within herself. And that is where God's closeness and nourishing is all present there in a beautiful way.
The relationship between a pregnant person and the fetus is that the fetus is completely dependent on that person. So it is, I think, a lovely image for our relationship to God. That dependence, but also that relationship too, that even though we're the dependent ones, there is this intimacy and love from God that doesn't make that like a domineering thing for us to be completely dependent. We don't have to be afraid of God's capriciousness. While I was talking about, this word like comes from womb because compassion is connected to pregnancy and therefore femininity and therefore women. It just, and I'm not putting this on, the ancient speakers of Hebrew. Obviously, we live in a different era where we have different views on sex and gender, and there's an effort among trans and other queer people to disconnect the uterus and other, characteristics of the body that get labeled as female, that we want to disconnect that so that it's not, gender is not determined by body parts. Of course, I'm not saying anything new for folks who are listening, but so me, like, even just saying it, I do love the imagery, and I absolutely love the image of God as mother, but I do want to point out that there is something about talking about, like, every pregnancy being a mother, right? Being a woman who's pregnant, and also that every pregnancy is happy and full of love, or that person is going to, be a loving parent. We know that's not always the case. It's both, I like it, but also, like, from a more modern lens. I guess what I'm saying is, if this were like a modern English word, I'd have more problems with it. Just to say, like, oh yeah, womb feeling is always positive and always feminine, blah, blah, blah.
Thinking in the ancient sense, in this coming from the Yahweh source, and just kind of the bodily language being kind of these metaphors for different things, because there's less womb, different whole, different function later on in the poem here.
What is it? I want to know.
Oh, nostrils, nose. It's not as saucy as I made it sound.
Which word is it here?
The wrath, the slow to anger. Some of that's the poetics of it. For me, trying to be a critically generous listener, I hear what you're saying, and I would not want to repeat that, right? Like, if I were going to preach this, I wouldn't say, and did you know that this word has to do with womb, and let me just talk about mothers and pigeonhole everything into that, right? Like, that would be a bad use of that.
It's really messy, I think, because it is important to point out images of God as mother or otherwise sort of female coded, because patriarchy is so dominant both in scripture and in our world now. It really reminds me of modern discussions on abortion. Like, it does make sense to say this is a woman's issue, but if you say it is only a woman's issue, you have a problem. Like, pointing out both is important, that it impacts more than women, even if, yes, statistically more women will be impacted. I'm not canceling this word. I'm just poking at it.
I want to pull on a thread that you were saying, Avery, there with the non-dominating kind of love. When you have a pregnant person, it is very much so a non-dominating kind of love, because it sucks being pregnant. Like, like, literally your bones begin to dissolve so that the child can steal the calcium to develop their own bones, right? Like, so, like, the cartilage in your body begins to break apart. Your whole region down here begins to break apart from each other to allow room for the child to grow and then to escape. Like, it is very much so a self-sacrificial kind of love, and it's not dominating in this way that is like the child has to have room, and so you have to get out of its way. And I love that vision of God as a parent who so desperately wants to take care of us, but also has to get out of the way for us to grow and develop in this way. The next word after that, compassionate, being related to womb, and then merciful, is the merciful is deeply connected. It's Hanun, and Hanun is this word that is often used to be the one who listens to the cries of the oppressed. This is the word that is so often used as, I have heard the cry of my people, and so I'm doing this sort of thing. And when you think about the fact that on the one hand, this is a word associated with a non-domineering kind of parenthood that is much better evoked through images of motherhood than images of fatherhood, in my experience. And you pair that with the one who listens. Well, the one who listens is the parent who wakes up in the middle of the night to feed the child. And as the parent who primarily gets to do that now, I get to embody this idea of mercy, but for the first couple of months when the baby was breastfeeding, that was my partner who got to do that. And so like it's a non-domineering kind of love, and it's also a kind of love that is intervening when we need it. And so trying to strike that balance that I'm trying to strike as a parent who's desperately trying to gentle parent my kids, where like, how do I allow you to have freedom, but also respond when you need help or need to not do something to get really hurt? And so I love this image of God as intimate parent, as sacrificial parent, because like I think the biggest struggle about parenthood that you just do not believe until you're a parent is that you are going to spend the rest of your life feeling like something was taken away from you. Like that beautiful child, you're always worried about them going away. You're always worried about losing them. And as they grow, they are going to grow into their own person. And you're going to lose them a little bit as they grow and develop and begin becoming their own person without you and developing an identity that is beyond you. And you hope to be the kind of loving and safe place where they will always come back. You hope that you'll be a place that is compassionate and merciful, very patient, full of great loyalty and faithfulness, so that they will come back when they're ready as their own person, as they go through the painful and difficult parts of becoming their own person as they grow, that you will remain a place for them to come back to when they need you.
I love that, and thanks for pointing out that the word merciful, I'm also looking in other translations, it's often translated gracious. I hadn't known that Hanun like carries that sense of hearing the cry of the oppressed. Like, this is one of those things where I'm like, see, we have to find a better translation that conveys that, because it feels important. Because I love that. Again, like Matt was saying, this passage being important for liberation theology, what is more important than the fact that God hears the cry of the oppressed?
Then we have this strange ending of this, which is our second time, and actually thank you Matt for pointing out the parallels between here and the first 10 commandments that we receive, because it is one of these things again that is like, I'll be merciful for 1,000 generations, but I'll punish people to the third and fourth generation for their sins. If I had a nickel for every time it happened, I'd only have 10 cents, but it's weird that it happened twice.
Yeah. I do say I like the one in Exodus 20 more, because it says punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me. I am troubled by the punishing children for what their parents did, but I do appreciate that love, the blessing, carries on 1,000 generations. That's so many years.
I wrote a sermon once where I figured out that I think it's a beaver. An elephant is about 250 times the size of a beaver. God's love is the size of an elephant, and God's anger is the size of a beaver. But if we saw a beaver and an elephant next to each other, we'd go, what the hell are those two doing together?
Well, and beavers, yeah. I don't think they would, but they're tough creatures.
You don't think they would?
Oh, no. Yeah. Dad jokes strike again. This idea, comes throughout different parts of scripture, not always. Like, some perspective shared is that idea that they want to, stress love and compassion, but I don't know, it feels like there's a sense of it being necessary for the people to also be like, oh, but God can get real angry too. Don't worry, like, God will hurt you if you do bad. Or I guess it could be part of their trying to explain their trauma, as we've talked about before, that if God's the one who did something in anger, then they can recover themselves by just being good now.
And the overall narrative of the book of Exodus, the first place where we encounter God's wrath, aka God's nostrils, is against Egypt.
Yes, yeah, against the oppressors, yeah.
This is against the oppressors, and in the top 40 hit that Miriam writes in Exodus 15, it's God's nostrils that blow across the water, so God's not rockets Pharaoh to his doom.
Yeah.
Here, that slow to anger, that word for wrath, I think it's very patient here. I like the CEB sometimes. I think it's kind of weak on this poem.
I feel that too.
Slow to anger is referring to these nostrils. God has a long nose, so it can cool down by the time it gets out there. If God's nostrils are blown out, like, God's really mad. In 32, after the golden calf, God's wrath is coming from the nostrils against the people of Israel. So we have that wrath against Exodus.
That's how you know you really fucked up.
Right, it's like the cartoon steam, right? Like, it goes red from the bottom to the top, and the steam shoots out their ears to calm them down, and the red goes back down, right? So, like, the steam went out, God was mad. But this time it's against the people of Israel. So I think sometimes with that reminder is maybe this can be that warning I think we've had on this show sometimes, that when the people of Israel become the oppressor, God changes sides. That same wrath that we saw visited on Pharaoh and visited on the oppressors, we're not immune from that just because we belong to God. If I were to turn around and start willfully exploiting people, then God's gonna snot rocket me. Is what I should expect. I think that's maybe how I hear that warning. In evangelical settings I grew up in, it very much is like, all right, God's loving, but don't forget,
God's gonna get ya.
God's also angry. That's very troubling to hear as a child. But I think when you reduce it to moralism, of course that's how it sounds. If God's only cared about, our behaviors, don't drink and smoke and chew and, all that kind of stuff, then yeah, how else can you understand it?
Appreciate that a lot. Like what you said is a good reminder that wrath is not always a bad thing, that when it comes to oppression, we should be really pissed off. God sure is.
I think maybe another thing to keep in mind too is that this is probably an understanding of a pretty tribal society, small village kind of thing. And, in that setting, when you have a family who does something to offend the community, as a defense, that community will then set that family apart and say, you are not really part of our community. It's a primitive preservation kind of reflex. And in a sense, what they're doing here is they are putting that fear reaction that they have to people who break down the community onto God. And they're saying that's what God does. And it's kind of refreshing then to see as, we move through the tradition, as it grows and develops, we begin to realize that God is pushing them beyond that and talking about compassion that goes for many generations. And as we move on in the tradition, that gets softened and they learn to reintegrate people who, maybe whose parents had offended the community. So it's part of a growing realization over time that over time they're coming to know their God better too.
Is it Ezekiel, the line, no longer will the people say that the parent eats sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge?
I was thinking it was Jeremiah. It was one of those anyways. But
one of those. And then Jonah, when Jonah takes up this poem as an accusation against God, actually, in the book of Jonah for being merciful against Assyria, Jonah clips off the whole punishing for generations. Jonah just takes the first part of all the nice things. Even in pulling this later into the tradition, there does seem to be some understanding of, or maybe some discomfort there.
In Deuteronomy 34:16, it says, "Parents should not be executed because of what their children have done, neither should children be executed because of what their parents have done." Does not seem to agree with this idea that kids should be punished for their parents' stuff. So even in that text, there's a different point of view.
This whole passage is all about how a people are experiencing God and trying to come to terms with who God is. And it's something that is developing and changing over time, coming out of their experience of God. So this is not simply, this is the truth, this is what God is. This is a people coming to know God. And I think that's a very helpful lens to take to some of these passages too.
Yeah, especially as we start getting deeper into like the sort of command sections of the Torah. It's very helpful to have that lens.
Which is a great transition to beginning to talk about these strange commandments here that we get. And, I say strange, but really they're, like Scott and Matt were pointing out earlier, it is sort of like a summation of Exodus 19 through 24. There are things slightly rearranged, but like you look at the annual festivals in chapter 23, and you have basically the same outline between 14 and 19, complete with the "no one should appear before me empty-handed" appears directly in both. They both talk about the importance of the Sabbath. They both talk about the importance of the festival of unleavened bread. They both talk about the importance of the festival of the harvest.
Yeah, they sort of have the same skeletal structure almost, but the chapter we're on now, the later chapter, probably came first. It's less the Exodus 19 through 24 is a summary of it and more like an expansion. And like, I think I personally prefer the Exodus 19 through 24 because, for instance, with remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy and you gotta rest, it specifically says you don't work, your kids don't work, your slaves do not work, which I feel like is very important, that enslaved people and animals and foreigners, like these humans at the margins and then animals who are not given agency typically, like that everyone must rest, I think is pretty radical, and we don't get that in 34.
And stay tuned, listener, because it's an even cooler commandment in Deuteronomy 5.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. But we'll get there eventually.
Quite a while from now.
It'll only take 3 years. We'll get there a lot faster if you donate to our Patreon, and we can double the amount of episodes that come out every week. But I digress.
I joined the Patreon today, so I'm doing my part.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thinking about these two texts together as well, and some of these parallels, likely reflecting two different traditions. One of my favorite tools to always bring out, that I probably mention every time I'm here, and I probably should get it like a mom tattoo on my arm, is canon criticism. Is that idea that, we're aware of these kinds of things, but we do have it put together as a story. And so to kind of look at how that story has been put together. And so, yes, this is probably earlier. Exodus 19 is probably expanding, but where it's positioned for us is that this is the giving of the law, again, after the first two tablets were destroyed. Which is interesting, because then how did we have all the other laws? Moses has a great memory, if that's the case, but...
He remembers how humble he is.
But not where he's buried.
Well, he was dead by then. Come on, guys. No, just...
Let's dive in specifically with these laws. So we have the first section that is just verse 10. I now make a covenant to have all you people all perform dramatic displays of power. And it's like, well, God, you already did that when you got us out of Egypt. But I think that's part of the evidence that this is not a section that was originally composed with the idea that they were in Egypt previously. I think that this is basically a thrown-in little section that is about how they're going to conquer all their enemies and all of that sort of thing. They're going to drive out the enemies that are before them. But the bulk of it here is that the driving out of these enemies is couched in the language that you have to destroy all of their forms of worship. Because, they prostitute themselves to their gods, and you don't want to prostitute yourselves to gods. You owe everything to me, though.
And I'm jealous.
Yep.
The CEB translates it that God saying, like, it's because I'm passionate that you must not bow down to other gods, but that's more traditionally jealous.
Ooh, I like jealous better. Passionate just feels like almost like abusive gaslighting language. Like, I'm just really passionate. Like, ooh.
Like, I can't help what I'm doing to you. I just got so worked up.
At least the word jealous is like admitting that they have a problem, right? Like...
Well, The Simpsons has a great actual distinction of what that means, where Homer uses the word jealous and Lisa tries to correct him, and Homer actually correctly reminds her that jealous is, as opposed to envy, is wanting to protect what's mine. And so it kind of loses some of its meaning the way we use it, because it has taken on a similar meaning to envy by usage. But I think that's how we're meant to understand that when we read that in the biblical text. We've often not updated that language in translations. I don't know that passion captures the same idea, but that's kind of the idea that's conveyed about God being jealous, isn't that, like, I see you playing with your friends and I'm mad, but...
Not like I get insecure or something, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That actually fits what I was kind of thinking of when I was reading through this earlier. I've been working on a response to Walter Brueggemann. He's coming up a lot this episode. In the past year, I've been reading a lot of books on, like, Palestine and stuff, for, the reason.
Just to make that very explicit, the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people by the state of Israel.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. The escalation from October 7th onward, though, of course, the occupation has been going on much longer. But Walter Brueggemann has some books. The latest was in 2015 about the relationship between Israel and Palestine. And frankly, I do not think he is what a Palestinian Christian pastor, Mitri Raheb, calls a liberal Christian Zionist, which is, yes, of course, I think Palestinians should be allowed to live here because the Bible says, protect the stranger in your midst, so implying that Palestinians are the non-indigenous people of the land. I wanted to see if he made any statements since October 7th happened, like, has he shifted his viewpoint at all, because in his books he clearly supports the ongoing existence of the settler colony Israel, not that he calls it that. So he has a recent article from April called God Have Mercy, and it is about what's happening, but it's actually it's just a word study about the Hebrew word harem, which is not in this passage, but it has that sense of jealousy, where harem is the word often translated as destroy utterly, when God is saying you got to go annihilate these various people groups. Brueggemann talks about how the first time this word is used is in Exodus 22:20. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction, aka like they belong to destruction, basically, is sort of the vibe. And I see that in this text too, where God is saying, if they worship other gods, they don't belong in this land. You have to get rid of them. And the idea is that because God is the only one who has a right to be worshipped, that all worship and praise rightly belongs to or is devoted to God. Giving worship to other gods is sort of giving them what belongs to God, and so they have to go. And of course, quote from Brueggemann, that usage concerning God's sovereignty, Brueggemann says, easily morphed into land seizure, since the land of promise was regarded as holy to God. And therefore, because it's God's, it belongs to God. Anyone there who supposedly doesn't belong to God shouldn't be there. And yeah, I just... like, the way that these sort of verses allow for basically genocidal intent. And I will say kudos to Brueggemann. He does name genocide when in this latest article he does say the word genocide about what's happening with Israel and Palestine. So kudos for that. But then within scripture, that God's sort of singularity is used to justify genocidal violence, which is quite disturbing. That this aspect of God is then sort of twisted to be, to say, well, we got to kill all these people.
It made a lot of sense for them in the sense that, this is in a polytheistic world. And the God that they are talking about worshiping here is their God. and is their God because God belongs to that land. The idea of making sure that that God is the only God worshipped in that land is about respecting that God, that they then take that as an excuse to go to start killing anyone who doesn't follow their way of doing it, is obviously very problematic, but it makes a lot of sense in the way they're understanding their relationship to God. And when we take that and apply that to, the various people, living in the world today, that becomes just all that much more problematic.
One of the pairs that happens across the Old Testament that is a little more nuanced because it doesn't get named this way, the way like justice and mercy or mercy and compassion are paired together. But this is throughout the prophets where idolatry and injustice are always paired together. You read through the prophets, you read through the major prophets, you read through the minor prophets, the two problems that are going to be there are idolatry and injustice. And we like to focus on the idolatry part and forget about the injustice part. And I think some of the neglect that we do in leftist spaces is we like to focus on the injustice part and not the idolatry part. And I don't mean to say that we should turn to our comrades and say, yes, so you also need to worship in the same way that I worship, but just kind of ignoring the damage that kind of language has done. And so I think that's one way to understand this idea here, and not tearing down, the altars and not worshiping is immediately followed by not making idols and then keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover. So there's even that association here of this idea of we can't have any of that. We can't have their altars, we can't have their worship, because that's going to lead to injustice. And to me, that's a lack of imagination. Who's the unjust God today, right? It's still mammon, it's still capitalism and different things. But what is the solution to capitalism? It's not to kill all the capitalists. It's to change them and to heal them, right? And I think, reading Christianity back in, which I hate to do and am doing more frequently on here than I like to, is kind of what we learn through the process of the Bible, as we hold the Old and New Testaments, is to gain that imagination that you can make a covenant, that if a covenant can be made between God and Israel to help Israel be holy, that maybe we can make covenants with each other to help each other be better. That maybe my God, who just trounced all of Pharaoh's gods, that if we make a covenant together, that, I don't know, maybe you'll be better instead of me being worse, if that's really my opinion of you.
And just to be clear, I and I'm not correcting you, I am sure you agree. Just to be clear for listeners, when you say that throughout the scriptures as we move, further in the chronology they're in the canon at least, that movement towards a bigger imagination does not start in the New Testament. That is, you can trace that all throughout the Hebrew Bible too, the book of Ruth, in which a Moabite is the star character and has a place in the lineage, whereas this text is saying, oh, do not marry foreign women. Ruth is all about marrying a foreign woman, and then you have Isaiah, a lot in Isaiah, which has this expanding imagination of, hey, God God doesn't just have to be our God. God can be a God of all peoples, and that God welcomes, this in Isaiah 56, the radical welcoming of eunuchs and foreigners into honored places in God's people. It's the Hebrew Bible is not a monolith. There's so many different views, and this doesn't have to be the view that we sort of take as, I don't know, as God's truth.
And that's why I don't like to bring the New Testament in so much. You're being kind to me, but I was absolutely being neglectful in that moment. Just not quite having the citation or the vocabulary to mind, because I do agree and do believe that those things are in places in the Old Testament as well. But just to be completely entirely unhypocritical for at least a moment, in that moment, I was
no, that's fair.
not accessing that part of my memory.
Paying attention to the things that are changing throughout the Hebrew Bible makes it feel a little less supersessionist to bring Jesus in as well, to say he is not something brand new, but he is continuing this pattern that we see throughout the Hebrew Bible.
If he was so starkly different, he'd probably been killed on day one.
Or at least Jewish people wouldn't have been into what he was saying. They wouldn't have followed him. They'd be like, what you're saying means nothing to us. Thanks.
And the New Testament is just a remix of the Old Testament, so seeing connections should not surprise us. So we're not reading the New Testament into the Old to say that this is the foundation upon which the New Testament continues on. So my theory is that basically this is again written in a period in which the people of Israel are not in the land of Israel or Judah, that they have been taken away, they're in the Babylonian exile, and they're trying to figure out what happened. Why are we out here? And we have these two contradictory opinions. We have the priestly class that says, well, clearly we're out here because we didn't worship God the right way, and the prophets who say, well, clearly we're out here because we didn't worship God the right way, and the priests say, well, it's because we didn't have our worship consolidated in Jerusalem. We worship all over the place, and people worship different gods and all of these other things. And the prophets say, no, it's because God's whole thing was taking care of everyone in the society, and you want to kill everybody in the society who doesn't worship the way that you do. And so we have this contrast between those two ideologies at work here in the text. And here we are seeing the perspective of the priestly class saying, we are in this position because you have not done this, because you have allowed this corruption to come in, this selling yourself off to the highest bidder. And we can see in the midst of that theology that there is something true about our own situation as well. What Matt was alluding to so well is that leftists are so often want to talk about the systemic problems that affect us all, that we don't want to talk about our individual actions that could possibly affect the systemic situations. Right? People throw around the term no ethical consumption under capitalism in order to vacate any responsibility for how they shop or how they spend their money.
Using that concept as an excuse to not do, at least make some effort, like some consumption under capitalism is more ethical than others. You know what I mean? Like, some companies are very actively contributing resources to some horrific things, such as the genocide in Palestine. And so, like, at least avoid those.
We have that, those two things out. And in our culture, we call someone who is just clearly going after one of those gods a sellout. When a ska band suddenly stops being a ska band and becomes punk rock in order to, make more money,
Goldfinger.
we call them a sellout, right? And that's the same thing happening here. The other thing that I think is so important is that this is being written by the elites who are saying we didn't have enough control in our society, and that's why our society fell apart. And the same thing is happening right now. Now, dear listener, you will be listening to this probably about 9 months after this comes out, but we're sitting here in the middle of having just had one of the worst hurricanes to hit the United States in the history of the United States being a country. There are areas in western North Carolina, in eastern Tennessee, in western Georgia, in western Florida, areas that are completely wiped out, places that are completely underwater, and the devastation is absolute.
A lot of these places are so far from the coast, they're so inland that this was not conceivable to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are areas of the country that are the most ignored, the most overlooked, the place that are reliable Republican votes, and so no one tries to go after them, no one tries to earn their vote, no one tries to listen to them, to hear their concerns, to provide them any sort of income. They try to give them coal jobs again that don't work and harm them and don't pay them enough, and so they don't have infrastructure, they don't have money, they don't have good roads, they don't have all of these systems that can be able to support them, and they are abandoned. Simultaneously, we have both parties have systematically underfunded FEMA and cut the social safety nets that had once allowed our country to have some semblance of recovery after disasters like this. And instead, we have Joe Biden, less than a week after the disaster hit, saying, we have given North Carolina everything we have. And it didn't last a week. That's how tiny the budget is in an era where we are going to have more and worse hurricanes every year because fossil fuel companies can't be held accountable for the effect that they're having on climate change, while we cut their taxes so their leaders can go and zoom their planes around to better and more tropical areas because they pay the budgets of both parties. Because of all that, the people who are most affected by these situations, who are hurt by the entire system, aren't going to get the help they need because the funds ran out in 6 days. You have that on the one hand. And then you have all of these leaders, all of these rich people, all of these NGOs that are established and whatnot, telling people, don't go. Don't go to Western North Carolina. Don't go to Western Georgia. Don't go to Western Florida. Don't go to Eastern Tennessee. It's too dangerous for you. If you go there, you'll be a problem. You'll be a burden. All of these things. Don't send supplies. Give it to us. Give us the money and we'll take care of it. They see that their power is threatened if we realize that we don't need them. And instead we have our comrade Margaret Killjoy out there who put out a beautiful series of tweets highlighting the fact that she is seeing people coming together and providing what they have. The thing that stands out to me is people making dry toilets, where this woman has figured out how to make them, and so people just keep bringing her buckets, and then some random guy had sawdust in the back of his truck and was like, somebody's going to need this for dry toilets, and so drove it up there and provided it, and now they're getting all these dry toilets to people so they don't need the water. And that you have teenagers who are driving out on their dirt bikes to get between little areas and bring supplies to the elderly people who can't escape their homes. And you have all of these networks of support. There are so many supplies in Asheville right now that they can't store them and keep them dry. And so you have people who are going from Asheville to other small areas in the communities to be able to provide goods there. It is beautiful what we are doing, because people are stepping up and saying, we have a responsibility to each other. We have to love each other. We have to take care of each other.
No one else is coming to save us.
Exactly. They ran out of money yesterday, 6 days into this disaster. And so we have the system of power telling us this is the problem, and if you interact with those people who are the problem, then you have sold yourself out. You've rejected the system of power. But I think on the other hand, we have God reaching through and saying, you can coexist with the Canaanites. You can coexist with the Hittites. That's why I told you that the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are all your cousins. Because you did coexist with them, and you loved them, and then you had problems with them. And my problem is not that you had problems with your neighbors. My problem was that you didn't treat your neighbors kindly. You didn't treat them the way that I wanted you to. It's the system of power that is getting in the way here. We'll jump down to this last law here. There are lots of interesting things happening in the laws here. The fact that you should ransom all of your sons, because again, God is the one that every first offspring is mine. And then if you read that, you'd say, oh, that means that you have to sacrifice for your firstborn child. And God very explicitly says, no.
No, not that.
You should ransom all of your oldest sons. Yeah, exactly. Give me a different thing for your oldest sons. And we see that continuing up to Jesus' time, when his family was too poor to afford to give a sheep for him. And so they brought 2 turtle doves instead, 2 pigeons, because pigeons are the OG gangsters and the most wonderful bird in the world. But I think that this is all coming back to this idea of don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. This is my theory. 40 days and 40 nights is not an exact time period. It is a metaphor that we largely don't understand, but we figured out from context that it means a long fucking time. And I think what don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk means is that it is a statement saying that don't allow the wealth and the riches that you have to kill your children. Don't allow the wealth that you're trying to accumulate, the holding on to life that you're trying to get, be the thing that weighs down the most vulnerable members of your society. That you bring the best of your early produce of your farmland to the Lord your God's temple, because you're not supposed to give God the worst that you have. You're not supposed to give God just 10% of what you have. You're supposed to bring the best of it to God, because the richest part of your life belongs to God, because wealth is not what matters. Your relationship with God and the people around you are what matters. The wealth belongs to God because everything belongs to God. And so the idea that you would have so much that other people can't have enough is anathema, because all of it belongs to God. You're stealing from God when you keep too much, when you keep all of your wealth. You are robbing God of that. You're not robbing your fellow human being. You're taking it from God. And God has given it to you so that you can share it with everyone. And so when you pursue that wealth instead, you get so much wealth. It's not like a young goat is small. You'd have to have a lot of fucking milk to be able to boil a goat in it. You have so much extra milk, you can't drink that. That's so much extra that you can literally fit a kid goat in there and boil it.
On the luxury of that too.
That is ridiculous. That is wealth beyond imagination. That is wealth to the point of excess, which is not what we're supposed to have. Instead, we are supposed to give those things up because they don't ultimately belong to us. They belong to God, and God gives them to us so that we can share them with others.
And that's a whole lot better than the point I made earlier that this is just some weird recipe that somebody was passing down. That makes a whole lot more sense. Yes.
This is turducken. Turducken is the ultimate excess of the Middle Ages of like
capitalist stew, cream of mammon.
You not only have a chicken to eat, you also have a duck to eat. You not only have a chicken and a duck to eat, you also have a turkey to eat. And in fact, you have all three of them to eat at one meal, so ridiculous that you can cook it in the most unreasonable possible way, stuff them all inside of each other, and not even eat a portion of it, because it is too much meat. It is too much food. It is the same idea.
So going back to verse 9 where Moses asks God to go with them, this just felt very no king but Christ to me, that I thought that you would enjoy that. So the other version of this back in Exodus 23, where God's going to send a messenger or an angel, depending on how you want to translate the Hebrew there. I was reading some interesting midrash in preparation for that episode that was referencing this part, that basically Moses rejected that offer of having someone, a messenger, an angel, go in front of them, and basically said, I only want to follow you. So Moses originated that idea.
Well, and that actually is a great segue into this last section about Moses' brightly shining face. We have that no king but Christ thing here, but we definitely have Moses standing in here as a quasi-divine figure who is literally taking on the brightness of God, the light of God, as he speaks with God. And is the only one who gets to.
I would note that many scholars think that this is probably, one of the most ancient religious practices throughout the world is the priestly figure putting on some kind of mask and speaking for the deity, to speak that absolute truth or the absolute answers through the mask. And many scholars think that that's the origin of what's going on here, that the veil is really, it's a way of marking that when Moses has this face covering, he is sitting in for God and able to speak that absolute truth. That's one of the most ancient religious instincts of humans, to put on a mask and to speak for the deity and take the power of the deity to yourself. So that is definitely a good part of what's going on here. But it also makes me wonder, and I did an episode on this a long time ago, what's actually going on under that mask? When religious institutions take on this audacious task of speaking for God, what is happening to that person behind the mask, and how are they coming to this to understand themselves the words of God, or what God is wanting to say to the people in this instance. And so that's the thing that really kind of fascinates me about this story as well.
All of that is super interesting. And also you asking, like, what is going on behind the mask? What you say is way more significant, but I do think it's worth pointing out that the verb being used for Moses shining is karan, which at its core has this sense of, like, pushing something out of you. So, like, rays, like the glowing that Moses has. I'm thinking of, like, icons that have the halos that, like, are ray-like. The one other place besides this chapter that this verb karan is used in the Bible is Psalm 69, nice, where it talks about a bull having horns, because the noun form of this verb means horn. It's most likely a horn. I assume this is the origin of some people, like, depicting Moses with horns.
It's actually one of the most famous mistranslations in histories. So what happened was when Jerome translated the Old Testament.
Oh, Jerome.
It's good old Jerome. When he did the Vulgate, when he translated the Bible
into Latin,
which of course became the Bible for throughout the Middle Ages, he mistranslated that. So he mistranslated as rays coming from the face of Moses, because of exactly that connection you're talking about, as horns coming from Moses. And so, the artistic tradition of representing Moses throughout the Middle Ages and beyond is to have horns on his face. And it's good old Jerome and his mistranslation. That's where it comes from. I mean, it was maybe an honest mistake, but he got it wrong. But you're right. There is a close connection between the two words, but he did get the wrong word. But boy, did he influence art, Western art.
I would like to take this idea of Moses' shining face and the veiling in a different direction and give it an autistic reading. I don't know, Avery, if this is something that has resonated with you at any point.
I know you've listened to all of Laura's Autistic Liberation Theology podcasts. I feel like this is related to the episode on God masking, though I don't think we brought up this specific passage.
That's definitely in the background somewhere, I'm sure. So, I mean, I very recently, so where we're recording this is October of 2024, and May of 2024 is where that I found out that I am an autist, as I like to say it, because I believe that's a vocation for me, and I like to make it a noun. I very recently actually preached a sermon about a different story about Moses and kind of drawing a connection. And so this idea of veiling, I'm very familiar with putting a veil on, figuratively speaking at least, because that's something I've done for more than 30 years, not entirely aware that was a thing that I was doing, but just knowing, hey, something feels weird about me compared to other people, but people tell me that there shouldn't be, so let's just bury that down deep under this veil right here. I read this passage and thinking about my autism as a vocation, and that's a very certain way that I am, that God has made me, that gives me certain strengths, that I believe gives me certain responsibilities, that helps me to have a different imagination for things in the world, is not always something that people can handle. People cannot always handle a neurodivergent person. And, earlier in Exodus at the mountain, here God says, don't come near, don't even let the animals graze. The people don't even want to go up. Back in 19, they're pissing their pants about the fact of encountering God. Here Moses has this close encounter with God and comes down and is shining, and this is something that they're afraid of. So he puts on the veil for them, basically, so that they can feel comfortable. He accommodates them, as neurodivergent people do almost every day of their lives that they're not in their own homes, accommodates all of the people around him by putting on that veil, so that he can communicate with them, so that he can try to distill some of this shining horns of light that he has come down from, that now seems to be a thing that is part of him, but it's only when he is in the tent talking with God that he can take that veil away, that he can truly be the person that he is, that he can truly experience that light, but that's something that just he has to mask and hide. And that feels a lot like the way that I have felt that I've had to go through the world through most of my life.
That's a beautiful reading that brings me a lot of, I don't know the right word, I guess just a deep joy to reinterpret it this way. Especially, like, for me, Moses is one of my favorite characters in Scripture because reading him through a disability lens is pretty inherent to the text when it comes to having a speech impairment or a speech difference. But yeah, to also have this idea of masking. And like you said, that he has to mask in order to not scare the people away. Before he puts on the veil, he encourages them. They want to stay away. And he says, no, come closer. He wants to invite them into this radiance that he has. And they just, like you said, they just can't handle it. And I do think at least part of that is something that you and I were kind of chatting about on Discord today, of when you're a leader, and especially a leader, like a faith leader, that's, like, for me, that's when people really cannot stand the idea that you're neurodivergent, because you're supposed to have this sort of power that people don't associate with neurodivergence. You have to have a certain demeanor. When I first decided I wanted to go to seminary, and at that point I thought I wanted to be a pastor, my own pastor was super supportive, super excited. She also did not know I was autistic. And one day in casual conversation, she mentioned another person who wants to go to seminary, and she was like, yeah, but I think he's on the spectrum. He just stands too close to people. He could never be a pastor. And it hurt so bad because I knew I was autistic. I was masking. Her comment made me realize, oh, I guess it's good I mask. And it was only till when I got into seminary, that I think a few months into the first year, that I was like, no, I can't do this anymore. I cannot be talking so, like, deeply and intensely with other people about God, who God is and stuff, without fully being myself. And credit to my pastor. She's wonderful. She's writing a letter of recommendation for me I want to go get a PhD. She's so supportive, and I always wonder if she remembers that casual comment. But I don't think she would say it anymore, because through me and hopefully some others, she now knows, like, yes, we can lead. But just with Moses, they can't handle a leader who, just is that different from them.
Just earlier in this recording, I was trying to say the word figure, and I have a stutter. I had a very severe speech impediment when I was a child, and now it almost always comes out when I'm very tired. I'm running on not very much sleep because I'm working a full-time job and being a full-time parent and also trying to do this ministry. And so, like, y'all were very gracious and allowed me to sit there as I just tried to get this word out for... Like, objectively, I have gone back and listened to sometimes that I've stuttered, and, it's maybe 10 seconds. To me, it feels like we've sat there for a half an hour while I've just tried to say the fucking word, and I hate it. It is one of the most embarrassing things to me, because, like, I'm someone who's known for being able to speak well. Like, that's why people want to have me around and listen to what I have to say, is because I am somewhat eloquent, and listening to a podcast about yourself is really humbling, because you realize you're not that eloquent when it comes down to it. But I will probably have the editors cut out the fact that I struggled with that word for so long, because it's frustrating to me. It's not something that I want people to listen to. I want you to get the most out of every single second that you listen to this podcast. But I'm sitting here thinking, well, maybe actually I should tell the editors, leave that in, because it's allowing you to see something that is real and true about me, and a vulnerability about me that I might have talked about before, but I've never shown you, because it is a part of my masking. It is a part of my protecting my idea of myself. I'm an intelligent person, so I don't struggle with a speech impediment, as if there are not brilliant people who have speech impediments.
Like Moses himself.
As if there are not geniuses who struggle to speak, like this fucking guy. Like and this is the guy that God chose to speak to all people for the rest of time.
And can I just throw in, like, I appreciate, you're, in many ways, you're all being kind of vulnerable, sharing some of the things that set you apart from the quote unquote normal population. But as someone who maybe doesn't have some of these divergencies, myself, I'm totally there with you, because as I look at this, I'm speaking as someone who's been in a religious institution for many, many years working. I totally am seeing this exactly the same. I mask too when what I do. I see Moses here. Moses is having experiences of God. He is experiencing God up on the mountaintop, and when he goes into the tent. And I too have had my experiences of God. But I also know my experiences of God they can be quiet. They can be sometimes full of questions and doubts. They're not necessarily times of great certainty. I'm in there getting into this really difficult stuff of God. But then when I go and speak to the institution or speak for the institution, what do? I put on a mask, and I need to present. I can't. I'll sometimes talk about some of the things I struggle with, but I got to present myself as a certain way of speaking for God, for the institution. We all mask, whether we're divergent or not, we all do it. And it has been part of religion and religious experience from the very beginning. And we can't escape it too. So I think this speaks to all of us.
Especially in an institution, like a scholarly institution, or church, where it can be a really sort of cutthroat place to be, where there's so much competition that you can't show any quote unquote weakness. So I'm absolutely with you that everyone masks in various ways, even if for some people, like for a lot of neurodivergent people, it's sort of in a more extreme way. That doesn't mean that everyone else isn't. That's capitalism, baby, and that's all this the way we're taught to compete instead of collaborate. Like you have to seem like someone worth listening to, and people don't associate disability with someone worth listening to, which is just a mess. And like makes me think of the little snippet in chapter 35 that we ended our passage on, where it says, like, do work for 6 days. It's about the Sabbath. You got to rest on the seventh day. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath will be put to death. And read literally, as I'm sure it was meant to in the original writing, that's pretty disturbing. Like, wow, not resting for a day merits death. But for me, thinking of it in a more like imaginative way, it's truth. If you do not take time to rest, working nonstop will kill you. You will wear out. No human body, no human body mind can not rest. You have to. It will wear you out.
One of the reasons why I got into podcasting and to do the retellings that I do was actually to take off that mask, to say, to express my love for the scripture without having to put on a mask to make it acceptable or to fit in with the church.
It's your tent.
So that's where I'm going in the tent and taking off the mask and saying, and look at this story and say that this is ridiculous or this doesn't make sense. And that's fine.
And that's a big reason why I love retelling the Bible.
Yeah.
It's an excellent podcast because you get to explore these things and come to these weird conclusions and be like, I never thought about it that way. But I love to serve as an acolyte in my church. And for those of you who don't go to a very high liturgical church, acolytes help the priest basically perform the duties of the things. I go to a sort of more Protestant service most of the time, and so for me it means I go up with the priest and then I help the priest wash their hands, and then I close the gates for communion, and sometimes I hand the offering plate to the usher, right? And mostly I like it because I get to be close to the action. I get to watch the bread and the wine turn into the Jesus right there. And that's always a little bit of an emotional experience for me. That last Sunday, there was just one of the priests and I, a priest that I don't know all that well, but he's friendly and whatnot, and was very kind and helped me along. But I ended up having a lot more responsibilities than I normally do because it was just he and I. And one of those responsibilities was providing the Eucharist for people and holding the cup and allowing people to sip from it. And it brought me back to this moment when I was serving as a Baptist youth minister at this conference, where I realized, no, I really do have to be an Episcopalian and I have to stop this and go do it, was because I had the youth and they came up to me and I served them communion. And they walked down the line and I was able to say a little blessing over them. And it was such a spiritually meaningful experience to me that it was like, that is what I'm called to. I am called to give the body and blood of Christ to the people who are being the body and blood of Christ. That is my calling. That's what I'm supposed to do. And while I was doing that, I started to cry, and all my youth looked at me funny because they're like, why are you crying? You're just giving us communion. And again, at my Episcopal church, I was just sitting there trying not to cry because I'm having this profound experience of not only receiving the body of Christ, not only that overwhelming emotional experience of becoming one with God in a physical way, but I also then get to do that for other people. That's a miracle. That's the most beautiful thing that I feel I could be called to do. And there are lots of other ways to give grace. Giving out food to the hungry is another way. Cooking a meal for someone you love is another way. But to me, that is just such a pure and unbridled place of experiencing God. And to me, my face could have been shining out gold.
And it concerned people, but...
Yeah, exactly. And I'm trying not to cry as I give people the wine.
Go into the tent, you can cry there.
Yeah, exactly. So, dear listener, if you have a chance to go and get close to the magic, I highly encourage you to do so. Any last thoughts on this text, my friends?
I mentioned I did do an episode. I did tell this story. It's episode 6.5, and it's called Behind the Veil. If you want to hear my story of Moses up on the mountain and behind the veil and what's going on there.
If anyone is interested in interpretations of God masking to go with what we were talking about Moses masking, the concept that God might mask too, you should check out, if you just Google, you'll find it, the Autistic Liberation Theology Podcast, and the title of this episode is Toxic Masculinity, spelled like M-A-S-K. Laura always has the punniest titles. But yeah, highly recommend it. We talk about God masking and maybe Moses and Elijah and Jesus, absolutely. So yeah, it's good stuff.
It's really annoying that Laura is funnier than me in my language.
Right? They are ridiculously punny in English, and it's not even their first language. It's incredible. I think they would be such a good ancient Hebrew author because there's so much wordplay in the Bible that everyone be like, they'd go to Laura like, hey, give us a pun for this passage.
I would just add another note about this story with Moses, that there is the moment that everyone is afraid and Moses calls to them. Aaron comes back and the leaders come back, and Moses gives them the commandments. And Moses gives the commandments to the people. And it is only then that he puts the veil back on. And so it's in that moment of that complete self-disclosure of self that he is able to best communicate what God has communicated in that experience of God's full self, almost full backside, but self-disclosure there on the mountain. And it has been my experience that people knowing who they are and being able to share who they are and being given the space to share who they are makes the world brighter for everyone.
The fact of the matter is that these are people who are rediscovering who they are. They have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. They have always had a hierarchy. And so they come out of this, and what do they expect to have? A total democracy? Do you think that they're going to be able to develop anarchy immediately? No. These are people who don't know how to make decisions for themselves, right? They have always relied on authority, and so they are constantly looking for an authority figure to solve these problems for them. And God seems to want to democratize religion and allow all people access, but instead they're constantly resisting. And we see the same thing happening in our own society when we have swarms of people who aren't interested in participating in democracy. They're not interested in caring for their neighbor. They're interested in electing a strong man who will eliminate their enemies so they don't have to deal with them. And the strong man can tell them what to do, and they don't have to make decisions for themselves. Because making decisions is hard. And certainty is a lot more comforting than having to make decisions in an uncertain world.
Along with, just wanting to pass it off to some big person, I think there's also the element of people just can't imagine. Like when we talk about things like communism and anarchy, sometimes people will be like, well, that sounds really nice, but it's just not feasible. We can't imagine a possibility that we haven't seen, or we haven't learned about instances of. I think it's the same for the people in the wilderness. They have not seen equity. They have not seen a world where they are allowed and empowered to make their own choices. So they just can't believe it. It's too good to be true.
On the one hand, we have people who don't want to make their own decisions. And then on the other hand, we have people who only want to make their own decisions. And I think that both of those are problems, because the people who can't make their own decisions try to elect someone or put in power someone who makes all the decisions for them, who tells them every detail of their life. And then on the other hand, you have people who are so opposed to any sort of intermediary that they have no connection to anything else. They don't understand anything else. And so you're off on your own trying to figure out the reality of an infinite being, and that's not something that you can do because you don't have an infinite brain. And, we need to be engaged in conversation and consultation with the people around us, not so that we can establish a hierarchy, but so that we can gather our collective wisdom and figure out the things that we need to do. None of us are capable of having a relationship with God on our own. We often talk about a personal relationship with God. That was how I was taught to talk about it as an evangelical. But I almost want to say I have an impersoned relationship with God. My relationship with God is found in the relationship that I have with Matt, because Matt and I can get on and talk about the shared experience that we've had and the deep love we have for our kids and the struggle that having those kids are. And then I can go and have a conversation with Avery about being non-binary and queer and how that affects our understandings of the world. And I can go and have a conversation with Scott and reimagine the ways that we're supposed to love each other and the stories that form us our myths. And I see God in each one of you and our relationships with each other. And most of the time, that's how I commune with God. And every once in a while, I'm standing there holding a chalice that represents God. And the thing that is most meaningful is that I get to give it to other people. Drinking it on my own would not have the same sort of meaning to me. What is important is that we are sharing it together. And Moses here in this story is desperately trying to share God with all of these people because he knows that having it on his own isn't the point. It was always meant to share. And it's not the point to have a hierarchy that you give all those decisions to either. Instead, we have to have each other, and we have to do it together in order to have a full relationship with God and the kind of community we are meant to have in the end. Well, Avery, Scott, and Matt, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. And thank you, dear listener. We so appreciate you being a part of this. Pastor Micah, take it away. And thank you, future Micah. The Word in Black and Red is a ministry of the Lamapack Alternative Church, a home for everyone left on the outside. Your contributions help this working-class project invest in better tools and spend time organizing, recording, and editing this podcast. And hey, if you support this 16-year project, we might even get it done this decade. We use Patreon for now, but keep an eye out for when we switch to a more ethical way of supporting the show. You can join in the life of our community in our wonderful Discord, where you can chat with the folks who've heard this episode, find links to purchase our merch, and participate in a spiritual community for everyone seeking to build the kingdom of God. We're also a fun follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, and Reddit. You can find the Discord, Patreon, and all the other ways to connect with us and these wonderful co-hosts in the show notes. Now, future Micah, say the profound shit. And thank you, past Micah. Now go. And do not gather up so much wealth that you manage to boil your own children in it. But instead, look to God with your community so that all of us can experience the love that God has as our nurturing parent, allowing us to grow and desperately wanting us to come back into her loving embrace. Shalom.
As we talk about these horns of light, I can't help but be picturing the glowing cat ears on Micah's headset.
Yep.
Micah, you are Moses here.
But,
Incredible.
Oh.